New England take.
So it's big time political season here in New Hampshire with all sorts of organizations throwing their 2 cents into what's going on over at the State House. But a constant thing I always see on many of these organizations' websites is that they are nonpartisan as they proceed to actually lobby for specific bills. So big question to me as someone who covers a lot of politics and news and things like that is, what does that mean? And I was very excited to schedule today to have Anna Brown, who is the executive director at Citizens Count. She's also the executive director over at the Warren B. Rudman Center over at UNH Franklin Pierce School of Law, to kind of dive into this confusing topic as someone who covers the media. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure.
Now, Citizens Count, I mean, personally, I view as like one of the few actual nonpartisan groups of the many that operate in the state with the way they operate. I mean, maybe that's a good little kickoff to the conversation is, what is Citizens Count and how do you make sure you're nonpartisan?
Yes. So Citizens Count is a New Hampshire-based nonprofit dedicated to providing unbiased information about issues and candidates in the Granite State, which your listeners may already be familiar, but is certainly a huge undertaking since we have the fourth largest English-speaking legislature in the world with 400 state reps, 24 state senators, roughly 1,000 bills a year. So there is an incredible opportunity for the public to get involved with all of that legislation happening, but at the same time can be really hard to keep track of. And so that's where Citizens Count comes in. We're trying to just provide what bills are up for debate, what are the basic pros and cons on some of those really hot issues, but also highlighting sometimes those lesser known issues that don't get as much airtime, because with 1,000 bills, there are tons that most people just never even hear about, whether it is waterfowl trespassing, so think like free-ranging ducks, or hot dog cart regulations. Those are some of the weird things I like to get into. But to your point, nonpartisanship, I think there's an important distinction between nonpartisanship and being unbiased. And so it's easy to say that we are a nonpartisan organization because that just means, okay, you're not formally affiliated with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or the Libertarian Party. I feel like saying you're nonpartisan is kind of an easy cop-out in a way, not to call out any organizations, but a lot of times when I'm talking about Citizens Count and I'm talking about whatever we're working on, I won't use that word because I feel like it's sort of meaningless, because just because you aren't formally affiliated doesn't mean that you're sticking to trying to just, keep facts that are even and fair. Of course, what does that mean, right? We all know that we all come in with biases, and I think that's the first thing that I really try to imbue in all of our organization is never delude ourselves into thinking, oh, I can be perfectly unbiased on this topic. I think it's more important to be aggressively aware of, oh, I have a bias on this issue. I have a really strong opinion, and then make sure you're pulling in other people at the organization who might have a different viewpoint. Or if you don't have anyone at the organization, then try to find someone else and say, okay, check my language on this, check what words I'm using, check my approach. What are my blind spots here?
Yeah, I mean, I can think offhand. We won't call any specific organizations out. I do that separately on other episodes. we're gonna play nice in the pool with this conversation. But I can think of two legal oriented organizations in the state that one is very obviously every single case that they're going for is specifically important with regards to political stances that are aligned line for line with a party. And there's another one that does the exact same thing for the other side. Like, I don't think people need to think too hard to know what organizations I'm talking about in New Hampshire if you're involved with politics here. But it's at what point, in your opinion, do you think, have you completely abandoned that whole moniker of nonpartisan when everything you're going with just follows along party lines?
That's interesting about how those organizations brand themselves. I think that's a good question. I sort of want to flip that around a little bit, though, and also point out that I think a lot of times when people are getting organizational information from whatever source it is, they want to find the partisan lean so bad. And I have mixed feelings about this, because I think that is a very important part of media literacy, particularly if you're looking at, okay, who's funding this organization, right? If it's like one donor and you know this person has this laundry list of things they care about, okay, then obviously that's important to know about. But at the same time, I think that as humans, the way our brains work, we're always looking for a shortcut, right? And we want to have a quick shortcut to say, all right, is this part of my team or is this the other guys? And so I think that when we're evaluating organizations, I would challenge people to not always just quickly write an organization off as like, oh, they're lefty or oh, they're righty. Even though I tend to agree with you, right? Like we're talking about there's some organizations where does the word nonpartisan even mean anything at that point? They're so clearly in one bucket or the other. But at the same time, if we know that their funders are different, or if we know that they have a specific cause, there can still be valuable information there. And I think it's important to look at that information in and of itself and not just write it off in one direction or another, because it's very easy as a person to sort of use that shortcut. I think we're all guilty of it and just like, oh, I don't want to pay attention to this. I don't want to look at this. And I also think it's pretty fair that both of us in this conversation, I think a lot of other New Hampshire people in particular, are not going to agree that the Democratic Party is right all the time or the Republican Party is right all the time. Like we have this awareness that they aren't pure philosophies that are grounded in completely consistent, ethical guidelines at all times. They can be both of them can be a little hypocritical at points. So I think it's important to be able to challenge yourself to look at that. As for organizations calling themselves nonpartisan, I mean, I think it's only a problem insofar as if the public does get misled one way or another. I would like to believe that New Hampshire residents are a little more media savvy than that.
It reminds me a lot of the cable news spectrum that you see out there. It's like, it was the Fox News tagline? I can't remember, but it was like the place for news or something like that.
Yeah.
Whenever you hear the place for news, take a look at what's being actually covered by these organizations. I mean, you can see, especially over the trends of the previous 15 years, especially many of these news organizations, they've kind of gained an activist or political bent in the way they cover
Absolutely.
certain stories. And it's the exact same thing with these sorts of groups. And people don't realize that these organizations that are putting themselves out there as nonpartisan, doing the work for whatever their movement is, like they have a purpose behind what they're doing. And that should always be something you consider before you get too far in bed with whatever they're pushing forward.
Yes, absolutely. I definitely look into who are their funders, who are the people on their board, what other affiliations do they have. New Hampshire politics in particular is a very small world, so you will see the same circle of people a lot of times involved in similar things. And you did bring up news organizations. I just want to put out there because I really enjoy it. You go to allsides.com, and what they will do is they will show the exact same news topic or story covered by different news organizations on different ends of the spectrum, and then, some that they identify as centrist. And I think it really highlights those subtle differences in terms of when we're talking about media literacy, where you should read all of those, right? You don't have to, if you read into something, that doesn't mean you're buying into rhetoric or propaganda or what have you. But I think it's important to stretch your brain and be uncomfortable in that way.
Yeah, if you get your news, like I'm a news dork, so I got a whole bunch of things that I follow on a daily basis. But if you go to, NH Journal is very straightforward. We're a conservative outlet. We are covering it with this lens. They're one of the few that are out there that are honestly out there saying it. I mean, you could kind of say the Granite Post is kind of sort of doing it. I have my issues with that, but that's unrelated to this conversation. But you should attempt to get both sides of the conversation. Nowadays, it's so easy to do that with the internet. Like you could just follow a couple different feeds, and don't rely on the algorithm. If you're on social, don't rely on the algorithm.
Please don't. If you're going to get manipulated, at least manipulate yourself consciously.
Exactly. Go to their page and let them ruin your brain directly when you're aware of what they're doing to you. Because it's the same thing with all these groups. I mean, whenever you see press releases, especially around legal matters, like you're going to see both sides of the story. It's same as as any case that goes to the federal district court here in Concord. Like there's going to be both sides of the story, and they're going to make their case in a specific way, but it may not be the way you specifically would make the case and get to that point. Like the issues are not black and white in almost anything.
Almost anything. There's been so many times that I have attended a public hearing at the State House or researched a bill, usually these lesser known ones. And it turns out that the issue is not even what anyone is talking about in the mainstream news. It's some other problem that there is bipartisan agreement. And a lot of times it's local officials coming in and saying, okay, this is what's really going on. So that's another thing I encourage. I always encourage people, if you can, go to a public hearing or two at the State House. If you're losing faith in democracy, just re-engage at this local level because it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, your organization has been involved with so many things over the years. I didn't prep you on this ahead of time, but I'm curious if you had any advice for, especially like a lot of nonprofits are freaked out right now with what's going on. The federal funding's changing. We're in the middle of a budget cycle at the State House. Money is up in the air for all levels of government right now. If you're a busy nonprofit owner and you don't have the time to whittle down through all these, should they start paying attention now when everything is chaotic, or maybe just wait until crossover, for example, or something like that to really understand what's going forward?
Yes, I've done some volunteering with like chambers of commerce, for example, and other individuals will come to me and they'll ask about bills a lot of times. And I do say, if you sort of have to triage, if you can't pay someone to do this full time, there are sort of two shortcuts that I recommend. And the first one might make you laugh because it goes back to the beginning of what we're talking about. But I say find an organization that aligns with the things you care about. And they a lot of times will send out bill alerts and updates and so on. Once again, you're only going to get that slice of the pie. But if we're talking here about how much time you can dedicate to the State House, that can be a good way. And then another thing I say is, yes, a lot of times wait until crossover, because the majority of bills will just get the axe before you even need to worry about them. And the good part of that, about that as well, is then you'll get that history of seeing what are the arguments that are being brought forward. What are some of the stumbling blocks here? Where might there be an opening where I'm overlapping in values between the sponsors, but I want to change the bill a little bit? So it can provide really helpful to sort of just give you a jump start when it crosses over to the Senate or it crosses over to the House. Because, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of bills, too, that I think get tons of news coverage and people get really up in arms about. And then they'll get slaughtered on the House floor it's usually the House because there's more of them in the House, more bills. And I sort of think to myself, okay, did everyone really need to get this involved in this? I don't know. Maybe there are some other issues we could have been paying attention to.
Yeah, you see it a lot, especially around the abortion issue of late. It's like, oh, we're going to have a 2-week abortion ban. Like guys, just take a breath. Realize that this is not. There's literally no Republican except for like 3 that are on board with it, and everyone else is outright saying it's not going to happen. If the governor is outright saying it's that they're never going to vote for it, the likelihood that it's going to make it through crossover into the governor's desk it's very, very rare that that's going to happen unless it gets really complex. Like I feel like everyone got freaked out by what happened with the divisive concepts law a couple years ago, where it got sucked into the budget bill, which the governor wasn't necessarily happy with, but ended up signing it anyways. And now the activist types are using that as the motivating effort. You need to get in right now. Like, people don't have the time to do that.
They don't. And I will just, since you brought up the abortion issue, that's one that I've been looking at because it's true. Governor Abbott has been very clear. I'm not going to sign any further restrictions. But there's several bills that are not exactly restrictions, but they are on that issue that I think people who are passionate about that issue would be interested in. So, for example, a right for healthcare providers to object and say, I don't want to give birth control even, I don't want to participate. And then their employers would have to accept that. So that has nothing to do with abortion restrictions. It's not on what the patient can do, right? It's just saying that healthcare providers can have that right to say, I'm not going to do this as part of my job. So I haven't seen the same coverage on that. And that to me is like, okay, I don't know where the governor stands on that. If I was a legislator, I might be interested to hear from the public. So yeah, it's not always good to hop on the really, really hot ones. Also, if you see a headline about at the state level about some crazy quote or some crazy bill, I will just say this. With 400 state legislators, even if only 1% are just completely living on Mars, that's 4 people. That is 4 people. And I swear every legislative session you get a couple who die. You get a couple who might be arrested. Like at this point, we're just playing the odds, people. So, definitely New Hampshire, we do it differently than the federal government. So by all means, that doesn't mean any of that is acceptable, but it's just a really different culture. They're paid $100 plus mileage, and there's going to be a little variety and a little bit of seasoning in with the regular legislative mix.
And one more thing I wanted to bring up before we wrap up is whenever you see data presented by these organizations, you need to be very careful that it's actually giving you the complete picture of everything that's going on. Like an example, it's a federal level thing, but the tax bills that are being discussed right now, the Trump extensions. I saw just 15 million times the same infographic where everyone's tax bills are going to go up except for the top whatever percent or whatever. And when you actually read the reports, entirely relying on Chinese tariffs, which is not the way it's displayed. It's displayed that your income tax is going to be going up. And that's the way it happens with a lot of these organizations, where they may not sometimes they are giving you the whole picture, but where do they get that data, and what is it? What are the what's the messaging they're doing, and does it honestly support that message? It can be really difficult, but you need to be very careful with it.
Yeah, I would say that anytime a message is too simple, I think, wow, there was a great communications professional behind this, but also it's not that simple. Especially when you're talking about budgets. It's never that clear cut. There's always a lot more going on there, which I don't want to discourage listeners from who think that they have to, I do this. It's my job. It's my entire career. It's to dig into these details. And I don't want to discourage people, but it's more about just being, I think, having less of that or more media humility, maybe, and feeling a little less authoritative just because you see something once. And just be a little more open and a little more inquisitive. So, and yeah, also I will say personal networks are huge. I think especially now, that's one thing I've been reflecting a lot in the age of social media. I think that originally there was a dream, and the Egyptian spring and all that, and we all thought that social media was going to be this wonderful unifier and get out pure information, and that's not true, obviously. And so I encourage people now to also get information from people in your community, people people you trust personally, because we all do have a lot of knowledge to share. I always tell people, if you are a subject matter expert in something, and so there's probably a bill before the legislature that you could be the most knowledgeable person in the room and you don't even know about it. So it's important to keep those conversations open with our neighbors and our family and our friends.
Anna Brown from Citizens Count and the Warren B. Rudman Center over at UNH Franklin Pierce School. Thank you so much for joining me. This is a fun conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, citizenscount.org to learn more about what they're doing over there. Lots of resources, especially if you're following any bills over at the State House and what these sometimes goofy lawmakers are up to. Also go to law.unh.edu/Rudman. They do some cool events over there. I worked at the school for a long time, and they get some really interesting speakers from both sides of the aisle, and it's definitely worth checking out. All right, NewEnglandTake.com. Be sure to like and subscribe if you're checking us out on YouTube. We're posting all episodes, audio and video, on podcasting services, and check out Weekly on the Granite Grok on Saturdays. He's resharing some of our episodes, so be sure to check out over there too. We'll talk to you soon.